Good evening, everybody. It's Steve with Real Progressives, and we have a special show for you tonight. Quite honestly, normally my approach is somewhat more academic. It's really more focused on the rudiments of economics and talking with various experts to bring about the truths that we don't get told by the modern media and by our education system and the apparent orthodoxy of the day. So what I decided, this was about 2 weeks ago, I was looking through my favorite Twitter feeds and everything else, and I noticed that Pavlina Trineva had posted a article about income inequality, in particular the gender pay gap and how it impacted women. And so I said, wow, what better topic to talk about than the gender pay gap in general? So let me go ahead and bring my guest on. Pavlina, welcome back to Real Progressives. How are you tonight?
Hi, Steve. Hello, everybody. Very well. How are you?
I'm good. So do me a favor. It's been a few weeks, months actually, since we talked. What have you been up to here? I know you got some really cool things. I see you're all over the world. What's been going on?
Yeah, a couple of talks. I guess the most exciting one is next week. I'm going to the European Central Bank on their invitation to give two talks. One is on modern monetary theory, and the other one is on the job guarantee. And actually, they first wanted to talk about the job guarantee, that like the idea really captured their kind of imagination. But I said, you know what, to fully understand the importance of the job guarantee and how you could run it, you probably need, we need to talk about modern money. And so they said, yes, I sent some papers. And so let's see what happens.
Okay, so, you know what the topic is, and you know where I'm going with this, but yeah. Just for our listeners, I mean, the pay gap is very real, but it didn't just start yesterday. It's not something that just came about, in the last couple of days. I mean, there's a pretty big story about women's inequality in America in general. Can you just kind of take us back a little bit and start laying out the storyline for how this plays out?
Yeah. So maybe the way to talk about this is first to explain how conventional economists talk about the pay gap. So whenever you hear, we don't really need any laws that will fix the pay gap, it's really because the pay gap is a result of choices, individual choices. So the way normally politicians and economists, mainstream economists, will talk about why women earn less than men is because they've chosen majors in college that don't pay as much as men, right? They don't go into technology math. They tend not to stay in the labor force for a long period of time, or they take time off. They have babies, and so they disrupt their employment path. They they may not put in the long hours, right, on the job. And so the way economists tend to think about these wages is a reflection of productivity, choices, how much investment a person has made in their education or in their on-the-job training. And so at the end of the day, when you start controlling for these things, you take two people, a man and a woman, and you start comparing them. And, if there is the same major, the same number of years of schooling, the same job, and if there's still a pay gap, then they say, okay, maybe there is some discrimination. Maybe the market, has some discrimination, but generally, if you have a competitive market, that goes away. So really, there's nothing you need to do about the pay gap. Now, this kind of way of seeing the pay gap completely ignores, decades and decades of history of how women entered the labor market, the opportunities that they got in the labor market, the opportunities that they got in education, and basically the path they walked. So basically what I'm saying is that the wage gap is there because there is a path-dependent process, right? It's a result of history. So let me give you just some examples of what are the kinds of things that I'm talking about. Women were not allowed in medical school all the way until like the 40s. So there are some very specific laws and concrete practices that simply marginalize women in particular fields. In many cases, women didn't have the right to their own property or their own wages. So the way to think about the history, you really have to start thinking about like the rise of the industrial era, right? When people started getting jobs in like manufacturing, for example. So a lot of women, it was common practice if a woman got married that she would be fired. So this was a practice that went in well into the 50s, late 50s. So girls, maybe after school, they'll get a job, but if they married, they'd get fired. Previously, when girls would get married, they wouldn't really have right to their own property. It would be their husband that will control the property. Women wouldn't have the right to forming their own businesses. These were called the sole femme laws. And so you can look at the history and see how there were legal obstacles, there were institutional obstacles to women entering the labor force. So when did they enter in large numbers? Well, during the war. Their husbands went to fight the war, and women started taking up the manufacturing jobs. The husbands came back from the war, and the women were fired, and they went home, in the home.
So that was like literally the only time in American history where we really, truly, honest to goodness, had full employment. I mean, like we're screaming full employment, and they had to sell bonds, and people thought it was to fund the war, but it was really to cool the economy down because, heck, we're at full employment. The next step is then we really do have an inflationary situation. Yeah. Absolutely.
So there's one comment that I just saw. I didn't catch the name. It was very quick, but it said the pay gap was there because men have felt the need to dominate or something to that effect. I think we should talk a little bit about this because, in the industrial, when you just have to think back 100 years ago when industrialization was really happening and when manufacturing jobs were becoming the norm. Working in a factory was a very demeaning life. It wasn't a pretty life. So society had to change in this new industrial world order. Society had to change to make it acceptable for people to work in these relatively awful jobs. And suddenly we developed these cultural norms, the male sphere and the female sphere. So paid work became the domain of male work. And then it became an honorable thing. Men were then eventually paid so-called family wages so that they can support their families. So, you have to kind of attach certain prestige to working in these pretty awful, industrial conditions. But this idea that paid work is the male sphere and the home is the woman's place is kind of an industrial phenomena. Before the Industrial Revolution, men and women worked on the farm together, shoulder to shoulder. And so this becomes like our new ideology. And then how men and women get paid is really socially structured, right? Men have to get a family wage to support a family, where if a woman were to pay, she's not supporting a family. She just needs a little extra money to buy clothes, hairpins, etc. And hence the word pin money. Women earn pin money, men earn family wages. So from the very beginning, the way companies paid men and women was different.
So now, did you get to witness? I don't know if you have enough time to do this or not, but have you ever watched the show called Mad Men? Did you ever get to watch that show?
Not one. No, I might be the only person in the world, but I know what it's about. Yes.
For me, second maybe only to Breaking Bad, The Wire, and The Sopranos, Mad Men was the greatest show of all time. It was a timepiece, and it truly showed the way women had to scratch and claw to even be considered worthy to be sitting there. It was like, yo, Toots, go fetch me a turkey pot pie. Go get me a coffee. Hey, Toots, you look nice in that skirt. Hey, Toots. And it was really, that was just the norm. Hey, go get me some cigarettes. Go buy the wife some flowers. And it was like, wow, you watch that with your modern sensibilities and it's shocking. But that's where we came. No, it was
No,
70s.
well, look, it's still with us in many
Yes,
ways.
it
I mean,
is.
these norms are still with us. But here's one thing. So when I posted that little note about the pay gap, I started digging into job ads in the 50s and the 60s. And, some of your audience members may remember that in a newspaper, you open a newspaper and job ads were divided, jobs for men and jobs for women. So, people were segregated in different industries from the outset. There are certain jobs that simply were not for women. The cultural norms kind of dictated that. And then I went through some of these job ads and I'm looking, there are a bunch of bookkeepers. So there's jobs for men, bookkeepers, and there are jobs for women, a whole bunch of bookkeepers. And then you look at the wage and they're different. The male bookkeeper, gets paid significantly more than the female bookkeeper. So these are kind of the overt pay disparities that you can't really do anymore. But they have been with us for about 100 years. So to talk about the pay gap, to close that pay gap, you need to know that there's been 100 years of history where wage patterns have been set in companies. Even today, there's plenty of data that find that women get paid less for the exact same amount of work. And it has to do with the institutional practice of how the human resources department basically negotiates wages for men and women. It's not, there's kind of a cultural standard that's carried from past decades.
Absolutely. So there was a girl on Mad Men named Peggy. And the story of Peggy, in my opinion, is spectacular. She was an awkward young girl, came in there kind of shy and frumpy. She walks in the door. She didn't have family support. She didn't have anything. She walks in the door and she's kind of a secretary. She has a great idea. All of a sudden, just to prove a point, to make a man angry, they promote her into the advertising part of the company. And so she's sitting there doing all the work and she's still paid like a lackey. And the people that are over her are getting all the kudos for her work, but then she's being said, nice little girl, now run along. And then they were going to put her back into being a secretary when the experiment went over, but she was pretty damn good at what she did. In fact, she might have been the best at what she did. And so, as you look back on it, I mean, it's hard to watch something like that when you have children, you have daughters, or maybe you're a woman yourself, and you see that and you think, wow, how oppressive. I mean, you feel it like your chest caves in as you feel the oppression and that stranglehold of what I consider to be a Calvinistic, what do you call that word? Patriarchal structure. Yeah. And so, but now though, like it doesn't make sense to me that there would be a pay gap in any way, shape, or form. I agree and I admit and I understand that women, oftentimes will be the primary caregiver for their children, so they will leave the workforce maybe for a period of time or a short period of time, even whatever. But the reality is that today it's almost inexcusable that we can't find a way to rectify that without pulling down men by elevating women. Women deserve every bit as much, and there's got to be some sort of I don't want to say reparations because that's not really the right word, but there needs to be an understanding of the damage that has been done so that we can get out of this situation and we can have prosperity for all.
So, it making me think about, three different things. One has to do with social and cultural attitudes. You're talking about the madman culture. That is what we call hostile sexism. Women are not as smart as men. They can't do the work. They're not as productive. They should stay at home. Like these are sort of, hostile attitudes towards women in the workplace. And, if they are sort of exhibiting male characteristics on the workplace, being aggressive, etc., these are not acceptable. And we see this, all the time in terms of sort of the uber bitch, kind of, label that it gets attached to women that tend to be more aggressive and competitive, etc. So there's that one. But then there's also another one that's sort of the more benevolent sexism stuff. And most people don't think about this stuff. And that comes out of a good place, out of a place where people say, maybe women should be protected because they're caregivers, because they bear children, etc. And maybe for these reasons, they should not be on the front line of war. Maybe for those reasons they should not be in the military to begin with, or maybe not even firefighters. And so, like you can kind of empathize with this sort of idea, but that is a form of benevolent sexism that says, we just shouldn't allow women in certain places. And of course, not all women are mothers, and not all women are caregivers. And there's a lot of diversity in that particular gender too. And so the idea is how you open possibilities, equal access to possibilities for all, and let people self-select, if they choose to go into those places. So in part, the pay gap is driven by cultural norms that were the old hostile sexist ideas, and some of the more modern, more benevolent attitudes. The second thing you made me think about was that I give to my students, for example, a task to interview their foremothers. So to talk to their mothers and grandmothers and to really get at the nuance of how those women managed paid work with the expectations of the family, rearing children, taking care of the family. And, you will find in general that, the older generation, they got some job and then they quit their job when they started having a family, right? So they never really had career paths because college wasn't open to, some of the professional degrees weren't open to them for a while because they were fired when they got married. And there were just various, obstacles. Then in the 60s, you'll find this cohort where women, take care of families. But then once the children grow up, they enter the labor force. And that, has to do in part with the civil rights movement and sort of opening up these, possibilities in the workplace for women. But today, first of all, you have single-headed households. You've got a lot of people who are working and who are taking care of families. It's a whole different ballgame, right? So it's not, for many people, it's not even a choice. You can't just choose to be at home because maybe there's a breadwinner in the household. But even if there is another breadwinner, we have a co-breadwinner model. Both people are working. Both people are taking care of children. And so then you have to ask the question, well, does the market provide equal opportunity for both of these breadwinners and both of these caregivers to meet the demands of the family and of the paid life, right? And here we come up with, issues about policies. How do you support families? How do you support children, mothers, fathers, and on and on.
So I wanted to bring up a funny one. Guys, I know a lot of guys, and there's one guy watching who's kind of trolling the ladies here, so this will be for him. The reality is that if you think about it, what could be more awesome for guys than ending patriarchy, right? Because right now, much of the laws in terms of the way they give custody, the way they do child support, the way they do a lot of things are a direct result of the inequality we bred into the system. Mm-hmm. Once you get rid of that inequality there, then all of a sudden it creates an atmosphere where there can be more equality in the courtroom when it comes to domestic affairs. So guys who sit there and worry and whine about that stuff, all the MRAs and all the other folks, you want to see some men's rights come to fruition. Give the ladies their equality. Give equality. Equality is all anyone asks for. Equal opportunity, equal access, equal treatment, etc. And unfortunately, I think a lot of guys want the best of both worlds. They kind of want to be, head of their household, but then they want to be treated as equals everywhere. They don't want to give up any of that. And the reality is they don't have to if they just allow women access to everything as well.
Yeah. So, this connects to a favorite topic of ours, and that's the job guarantee.
Yes,
so
it does.
Here's how this connects. If the labor market does not provide jobs for all, you will have this problem. There will always be some people who will win in the labor market and some people who will lose. So in some ways, this has played out in terms of how gender has done in the labor market. So just let me give you an illustration. It is true that the participation of men in the labor market has slowly declined in the post-war era. the participation of women was very low, very depressed, after the war until the 60s and 70s, and then it took off. So, you look at the numbers and then you say, hey, women seem to be benefiting at the expense of men, but, that's kind of looking at something on the surface and not really understanding like what's going on. The economy produced fewer and fewer and fewer jobs over time. They become more precarious jobs over time. They become lower paid jobs over time. In a way, women's liberation movement was in a very perverse way helped by the fact that jobs were not well paid. And so men lost their stable employment. Women entered not in their jobs, not in men's jobs. They entered in the service sector jobs because the economy was changing. It became less manufacturing economy and more of a service economy. And so on the surface, it looks like that men were losing out and women were gaining. But what was happening is the economy was becoming more precarious, not generating the employment opportunities that these families or individuals needed. And so we need to, how could you figure out how we can benefit both, or if women or men should be given their due? Like, we can't figure out unless we have full employment. Unless everybody has access to decent work, we can't figure out, how to create, equal opportunity if there's not equal access to opportunity. You see what I mean?
Absolutely. So let me ask you a question, because I think this comes into you were one of the people that was actively, I read your article about how Bernie Sanders needed to add a job guarantee to his platform. In fact, I posted it again today, a little bit late, but I always post. I post it probably once every couple months. But it's important because even though there's a lot of people that watch the show that are really sour on Bernie, and with some good reason, because they felt like he should have done something other than co-sign a neoliberal. And there's a lot of reason for that. But that said, all the platform is still solid. Everything that we were fighting for then is still solid today, with or without Bernie Sanders. And so my goal has been to keep that platform alive and well, instead of pointing at Donald Trump all the time. A lot to point at, but the idea though is that it took so much effort to make Bernie's ideas become more than pie in the sky, to become honest to God. This is what we need. This is what we demand. And so if you forget about those and you wait till the next election, those politicians are not going to be held to account to raising the bar to that level. They're not going to be fighting for that. They're going to be fighting for what's most convenient. In fact, somebody on my team even told me that I need to focus on things that are far easier, like the fight for 15 and all these other things. I'm like, that's a Band-Aid on a heart attack. We need to be sitting there looking at the root causes. And I'm here to teach, and you're here to teach. So when you think about that, the paid family and medical leave, that was a key component of Bernie Sanders' platform. And it's a key component that we could enable by understanding, not implementing, but understanding modern money since 1971 to present in the United States. By understanding how our currency works, we're able to easily demonstrate through understanding sectoral balances and other things that we can afford to give a paid family and medical leave as a part of a citizen's benefit in this nation. People are like, we can't afford it. That's pie in the sky. What do you want, a freebie and all this crap? And it's like, guys, stop looking victory in the face and snatching defeat. I don't get it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you that the biggest obstacle to passing the kind of policies we need now is just not understanding the money. I mean, this is absolutely foundational. So, I've been writing something on like Trump economics this week, and, I've been looking again historically of what has happened to our jobs. And I'm going back to that point that manufacturing jobs were really awful, miserable jobs for a long time. People worked 16-hour days. They were paid miserable wages. There was child labor, awful conditions. They were not good jobs until we figured out what to do, until we kind of established a standard of what constitutes a decent manufacturing jobs. We put in place minimum wage laws in the U.S. It was, very late. the federal minimum wage law, even though states, tried to do that earlier. But essentially, it took us with a series of steps and series of laws to make the labor markets strong. And then we came to full employment, in part because of the war, of course. And so now you've got you've created the preconditions for the development of the golden age, the good communities. So today, people are nostalgic over the loss of manufacturing jobs, but they're really nostalgic over the good pay. They're nostalgic over the communities that those good jobs brought, that overall welfare. So what is happening to our economy today? We are losing manufacturing jobs, and that loss is irreversible. I'm very sorry to say this, but it's just irreversible. And the service sector is increasing. So you know what our economy is? Our economy is it's services. It's how we take care of each other, right? The vast majority of people are engaged in service sector to help each other. Feeding, health services, education services, childhood education. But these jobs, this is your new economy, right? But these jobs are poorly paid. They're precarious. They're unstable. No wonder people are longing for the manufacturing jobs. So what we did for manufacturing jobs, we just have to do for service sector jobs today. We need to figure out new laws that make service sector pay good. And so part of that is enhancing what we call the social wage. In other words, putting in place universal benefits that supplant our wage, like paid family leave, like Medicare for all, like Social Security, good Social Security for all, universal child care. All of these things are supplements, and if they become institutionalized in our fabric, then that becomes the social wage that improves our lives and standard of living in a service economy. We don't have anything near, Bernie Sanders had the components, right? Free education, free Social Security, Medicare, because because he in a way understood modern money, even though he didn't speak of it. But what I'm saying is that this is the next step, and so the battle that you're fighting, that's the next step. We have to understand money and budgeting and how these things are paid for, so that we can fight for the social wage.
I went on a tear earlier today. I'm not even going to lie. I don't usually go crazy on my own Facebook wall or Twitter and stuff, but somebody called this my pet economic theory. And that infuriated me because, first of all, this is as much of a theory as gravity is. And second of all, reality, which is just a description of how our federal financing works, should not require a sales pitch. I should not have to sell you that you have to breathe to live. And that's what this is. And so I became very angry because in reality, economics is the unifying factor. Everybody says, how is the left going to unite? How are people going to unite? I'm telling you right now, this unites the 99%, not just the Republicans or the Democrats or the Greens or the Libertarians. It unites all people that work for a living. It does not necessarily unite the financiers and the rentiers and the people that are really, really making money without doing anything. The people that really work for a living, this is a plan that enables them to live a life more abundant. And I don't understand why people would in any way, shape, or form not want a life more abundant. But yet, there they are fighting tooth and nail against you for trying to improve the world for everybody, not just black people, white people, gay people, straight people, women or men, all people. I don't understand.
I would think that the 1%, I get why the 1% might not be behind this, but it's a very pro-business policy. Imagine if you had universal health care. Your employer doesn't have to pay for health care. Right? So it is, that's the whole point of the social wage, that it doesn't have to be borne by the individual corporation.
Yeah, and let me say one more thing too. And I think, this is where Steve gets, I go a little communistic, I guess. I don't know. Not really, but central planning anyway. And, I live in the state of Pennsylvania, that has there was an article in Penn Live back in the beginning of January. It said that the state is $600 million shy in revenue. Its budget target is $600 million shy. So Naturally, if you're $600 million shy in your tax revenue as a non-currency issuing entity, which the state of Pennsylvania obviously is, that means you've got to cut services. That means you've got to raise taxes. That means you've got to do something to find the revenue. And I have long been an advocate not to replace programs, but I believe that there's got to be a way for our federal government to fully fund the states or do some sort of revenue sharing for states that are not, net importers versus net exporters, net producers versus net consumers. Because like you look at somewhere like Michigan, right, or Buffalo, or some of these, or quite honestly, Pennsylvania even. These are states that once had burgeoning industry, steel industry, auto industry, you name it. And then all of a sudden they got a sweetheart deal, the businesses got sucked away, and the people are left trapped. Number one, the job guarantee fixes that. But number two, if we had some way to fund these states, you let them manage it, you let their 10th Amendment work, whatever it is, but set a 14th Amendment standard for what it constitutes to be right with the world. And then let them go ahead and do it. Because right now, every state that doesn't give away the race to the bottom, the sweetheart deals to the businesses, they end up watching corporate flight happen. Right. And then they go somewhere where somebody's given away the farm. And then the people are left destitute. And that includes women, that includes men, that includes everybody. But most importantly, it's the people least able to absorb the shock. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. What do you think about that? It's my idea. I don't know if I'm right or wrong or not, but I keep saying it. It sounds good to me.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so here's you don't have to socialize everything. You don't have to pay for all of their budgets. But this is the way one way to think of it. I want to preface this by saying that states have balanced budget amendments. So they themselves have put in place a straitjacket they don't need to have. So, if a state goes into deficit, it's not quite they don't have the ability to fund themselves the way the federal government can, but they still have a higher ability than businesses or households. Some state borrowing, municipal debt, is pretty highly rated, etc. But your point is about the social wage. What at the federal level we consider to be the minimum standard of life that has to be guaranteed. And then, you establish benchmark conditions. And, I always revert to the Economic Bill of Rights. You guarantee these basic necessities, right? Right to a job, right to, some income security in retirement, right to shelter, right to education, and, clearly outlined. And then those really should be federal functions. And they were federal functions until about the 70s and 80s when we started devolving them to the states. Of course, this is the strategy of defund and destroy, right? So, let the states decide how to manage these budgets best, but, states function, in an entirely different way, just as you described. They've got to slash spending in recessions, precisely at the time when they should be increasing spending to offset the private sector. So, that was one, awful kind of structural, historical trend that began. So, I would, put the responsibility of funding for these essential programs back on the federal government, but they can be so locally administered, absolutely. Just administer them, but the funding needs to come from there and has to be guaranteed. And so when you establish the floor, that is essentially what we want right now. You can have your robust private sector, and that private sector is going to move through some cyclical, ups and downs. But you don't allow the economy to fall through that basic standard that you have established, right? You don't allow people to fall through. You do not allow people to be used as the buffer, right? Whether it is the unemployed, whether it is women, women will tend to, let's say they've chosen to stay at home to take care of children, but if the family situation is really difficult, they'll pick up the occasional odd job. So there is that sense in which you're a buffer to kind of supplant the livelihood of the household. So, our current economy uses, people as buffers. And what we just need to do is just establish the minimum.
So I want to say something here real quick, and I'm hoping that we can cut what I'm about to say into a small segment, because these hour-long segments, while they're good, they tend to be difficult to get some of the repeats. But this right here is really important to me, I think. As you look at what jobs could be, we talked about this the last time you were on here. Ellis has spoken to it. Joe Firestone, just about every person that I brought on here has touched on what the federal job guarantee is. And one of the things that Ellis says that I've become like just enamored of, and it kind of reverts back to a Jill Stein thing, where she talked about instead of having unemployment offices, having employment offices in every community, right? And the public purpose, which Joe spoke to, but Ellis comes back and says, you know, we could fund people that are surfers to teach surfing lessons. We could give people that play guitar, you know, the ability to play at an old age home or whatever value to the society, artists. And he has a very different vision. It's a much more liberal arts vision. You know, it's an expansive vision because the UBI folks, the big folks that come in here, universal basic income guarantee folks come in here and say, hey, we don't need that. There's not enough jobs, blah, blah, blah. And people don't understand that when we talk about forced what's the right word I'm looking for? Unwanted unemployment, right?
I don't know.
Involuntary, that's the word I was looking for. You know, these individuals are assuming immediately that we're saying, hey, you know, move one piece of paper here to there, make work and stuff. But the public purpose is very different. I mean, I remember growing up, it wasn't that long ago, that I could go to chorus every day of the week, that I could go to band practice every day of the week, that I could go to gym class every day of the week. Now kids go to gym like one every third Wednesday of the month or some crazy nonsense, or maybe they have to pay money to be able to go to take band class now. It used to be, you know, you had to get your instrument, you could rent it or buy it, but the class itself was part of the curriculum. We've gotten so far away from the public purpose in this country. I really believe the job guarantee has a much broader it could have a broader implementation than just a buffer stock or just a, you know, good living wage. I think there's some more that could be added here. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I used to live in Kansas City. You go to the Kansas City Jazz History Museum, and you see the generation of jazz musicians that were funded by the New Deal projects. You know, you come here, right here in the Hudson Valley, you go to FDR's house and museum, and you see the poets, the literature that was funded through the New Deal. The arts, to me, of course, the public purpose is, you know, we have to nourish the body, you have to nourish the soul. And so, you know, the way I think about job creation is that we actually have some emergencies we have to address. You know, we have some urgent things we need to take care of right now in terms of some sort of environmental sustainability, green jobs, etc. But then, you know, after you've solved the emergency, then you think of what constitutes the good life. And, you know, what are the sorts of things that we want in our communities? And, I keep coming back to the public library. I mean, these are such wonderful community centers, and, you know, they offer whatever they can possibly offer there, you know, some after school homework activities, some reading groups, you know, some other classes for different ages, but just think of what you would like, you know, for yourself or for your kids or for your community, and let's just ramp that up and use those centers to be the place where we create these so-called jobs, but they really are the kinds of work that enrich our life. And so, yes, you're right. You know, now in the schools, you know, we have this mad rush to teach STEM, and then we have forgotten that kids actually need to sit and paint, you know, uninterrupted for some time. They need some physical activity, and it can be just once in every 10-day cycle, right? It has to be, you know, part of what a rich educational experience is, but we don't have funding for the arts and the extracurriculars. So, I mean, there is so much that we were able to do before that we can do, and you know, provide new things for a better life.
Absolutely. All right. So let's get back. I want to be able to make this more than an academic exercise for our audience so that they understand that the things we're talking about are not just some pet theory, that this is the underlying issue for the green environment, which helps families and children. I mean, how many diseases and sicknesses do we have in this country today as a result of poisoned water, foods that are not grown properly? I mean, the kinds of energy that we use are destroying our planet. This impacts everybody's lives. Can you make a case in layman's terms for the average person why the things we're talking about matter so much?
Well, because, I mean, I don't want to be dramatic, but the future is at stake. You know, we're down on a path of literally destroying everything that we built so far. You know, I don't know if I said this on your last show, but, at the turn of the last century, we had an enormous illiteracy rate. You know, people, that lived in this country, were relatively poor and educated. We emerged out of the golden age with one of the best education systems in the country. We neared 99% literacy. I mean, we achieved extraordinary things with direct involvement and direct government funding in a very short period of time. So many of the things, how the buildings and the parks and the, hiking trails, the airports, they're a vestige of that time. And you see the whole thing, the sort of the civilization that we built kind of crumbling before us. And we're not just losing what we had built before because we don't understand money, because we impose austerity, because we impose cuts all across the board. And there's like a general sense of immiseration. But also, we can't quite look to the future. Like, what would the future bring? We don't just want the stuff that we already achieved in the 60s, right? We put a man on the moon, right? Now we have a different man on the moon missions, right? We want to be able to dream about that, where are we headed? And, like with all of the advancements in technology that are happening, I should say that they're coming with a very, very significant subsidy by the public sector that is socializing some of those losses. So even the technological developments that are taking place today are example of what public investment can do, right? They're an example. And so we need to start thinking about this, about the broader welfare of society and our economy. And so that's what's at stake. So long as people cling to these old notions that just can't be done and we just don't have the money, forget it. And, I have to say this, when we listened to Trump's address and the response by the Democrats, one of the first things that we heard was, hey, we turned the deficits into government surpluses.
Horrible.
Now, you cannot have a party that uses this as a success story, right? That fails to understand that that is what pushed the private sector in enormous deficits. And this cannot be sort of repeated as the kind of success and goals that we're looking forward. It will be doomed if this does not get remedied.
So I'll tell you, somebody else told me, he said, Steve, people don't care about your silly modern monetary theory because they're starving. They're trying to figure out how to put food on the table. And I'm thinking to myself, what could be more important than understanding how we can make our government fund this stuff to get money into the economy so that we can eat, so we're not sitting there crying over spilled milk and not having an answer for how to fix it. And that might be the most, I was so angry today. Like I don't think I've ever been that angry before, because it was like, you should be a student right now. You should not be presuming to teach. You should be a student right now, because the things coming out of your mouth are killing people. It's a murder by proxy. And when people say stuff like that, they don't realize that everything is economics, unfortunately. Unfortunately, however you want to place it, we need money to buy food. No, you can't eat money, but you can't eat food unless you're stealing from someone. So you've got to have money. And unfortunately, that's the way society works. And People want to talk about a resource-based economy. What about the Venus Project? What about this? Well, you know what? Someday down the road, if that ever happens, and Republicans decide to have that too, because we are in a pluralistic society, if some point in time that we're able to get them to even believe that we have a modern money system, as opposed to thinking taxes fund spent, at some point in time in the future, right? But for right now, my goodness, we've got the gift to feed people. We've got the gift to make everyone employed and to have shelter and to have clothing and to have an education and to have health care. And yet they sit there and say they don't have time to learn your silly pet theories. And that infuriated me to not see that tie together. This is it. This is why I wake up every day of the week as just an activist. I wish I could have gone to UMKC. I wish I could have sat there with you all and worked through these things. But I'm just a purveyor of the research you guys have done, and I thank you so much for it.
No,
it's changed my life.
No, I thank you because we won't make a dent amongst economists. I mean, maybe a little bit. Maybe the conversation is shifting, but where change happens is precisely where culture is constructed, where it's shaped, and that's people like you. It's other people from other disciplines that are getting this. And you just reminded me of. That piece that you posted that I wrote on why Bernie Sanders should adopt the job guarantee, it starts with my favorite quote. Argue for your limitations and they're yours, right? You will own them. If this is your eyesight and if you say that it cannot be done, then it cannot be done, right? And so, what we're trying to do is kind of expand the horizon of possibilities and show the technical reasons why this can be done. Maybe society doesn't want full employment. Maybe society wants to come up with other reasons why not everyone should have a job. But it cannot be because the government cannot afford it, right? I will still reject the other arguments too. But let's just have the argument on the correct premises.
Right. The other thing that's come to mind of Relate is, as this is not an area that I've heard you speak to, but I'm sure you're fluent in this. The GOP is only a state house or two away from being able to call for a constitutional convention. There are enough Democrats out there who are silly and don't understand economics who think a balanced budget amendment would be a grand idea. And, I had John Harvey on the other day. I know John's a friend of yours, works with Fidel and others with the Beissinger Institute. This is basic stuff. Stephanie Kelton was interviewed in that great Business Insider story about how the Clintons destroyed the Clinton surplus destroyed the economy. People still haven't learned these lessons yet. And here we are right now today in a situation where we're about to have the possibility of a constitutional convention and a balanced budget amendment passed bipartisanly because people just don't understand. And then you've got these folks that somehow or another think you got to dig your money out of the ground. And you've got a whole host of other, just chirping from the sidelines, and they're not focused. What do we do to help them understand the absolute calamity of a balanced budget amendment? How can I say this to them in a way that will make them wake up and understand this is that it's not just some pie in the sky. This is here and now present danger.
Yeah. The problem really with the balanced budget amendment is that it institutionalizes a certain type of government behavior. You can have your balanced budget amendment, you're not going to balance your budget. That's just a reality. The federal government will simply not going to balance the budget. The budget is not under the direct control of government. States have balanced budget amendments, but they do not balance their budgets over the long run. When the economy goes bad, they're in a deficit. When it's good, they try to run a surplus. They have a reserve fund to, help themselves with that. So the federal government, even more importantly, cannot do this because the federal government still has more responsibilities for the macro management of the economy, and it has automatic stabilizers. Tax collection is by necessity an automatic stabilizer. If your unemployment spikes, then the government doesn't collect enough taxes. And it doesn't matter what you do to spending, you're just going to go into deficit. And if you try to slash spending, so this is the problem with the balanced budget amendment, that it institutionalizes this behavior. Then it prompts an automatic cut to match the falling tax revenue. So of course, all of these things happen with a lag. You don't realize that you are going into deficit until after you crunch the numbers and you figure out what the budget ends up being that year, right? After a couple of quarters, or however, whichever way you measure it. So then you start cutting. So instead of acting as counter-cyclical, trying to help your economy when the economy is suffering, putting a little bit of money when people won't be spending, you actually take more money out of the economy at a time when the economy is suffering. So then you go into a bigger deficit, right? Then you try to cut more. And so basically you do create a situation like Greece, where, the IMF and the European Central Bank, they kept advising them to cut. And 25% of their GDP, disappeared in 5 years, worse than the Depression in the United States, right? They didn't even recover as quickly as we did after the Great Depression. So the balanced budget amendment makes the counter-cyclical features of government's budget pro-cyclical. And that is the real travesty here. Because after the Great Depression, we understood that is the function of government, to be counter-cyclical, to stabilize the economy when the private sector was worried, when the private sector didn't want to spend, when there was not enough employment growth. And so, again, this would be kind of one of the last nails in the coffin of the welfare state.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that, I've come to believe, and I would like to get your take on, it seems like and quite frankly, Stephanie Kelton did a great tweet the other day. It made it to our wall for sure. And she basically said, I sometimes wonder if I should give up on trying to make people believe they deserve better. It's something to that effect. Mm-hmm. And the reality is that we have been so beaten down as a society, even though we feel like we got big screen TVs and things like that. That's not what we're really talking about. It's the quality of life that we have, and our quality of life is horrific. We're nowhere near self-actualization. We're nowhere near any kind of the priorities that we have. It's counterintuitive to be pushing paper here and there when the reality is that there should be not only a balanced economy, but a balanced life. When I look at this stuff and I think about a balanced budget, the stress that would put on people, human beings, knowing full well, oh my God, we're coming up to this horrible, deadline here, and now we got to cut things, and now we got to slash things, and we don't have buffers. You know what I mean? We don't have stabilizers in our lives. Even if we have a little bit extra money, we're still not in that position of having built-in automatic stabilizers. I don't think people really truly understand this. And as I've talked to different people, they're like, well, what's so bad about balancing the budget? And they're still praising Obama for reducing the deficit. I mean, Occupy Democrats has this awful meme, and anybody that pays attention to Occupy Democrats for your economic lessons, you're really missing the boat here. But they are still lauding this. This is like they are eating this up, and like they really believe this. They really, really believe this, Pavlina. How do we penetrate that thickness and get to where prosperity is at least, is it even part of their game plan? Is it literally pure neoliberalism? Is that all they support? Are they that bought that they don't hear any of this?
I mean, I do think it's a neoliberal ideology that, it's market-centric. The role of the public sector is to support the private sector, and to, even for the private sector to provide the public functions that were traditionally the public sectors. I mean, I'm not convinced that people in Congress don't understand how government funds itself. I think that they do. I think that the balanced budget amendment is used precisely so that it institutionalizes certain government practices. It's used as a tool. So, I mean, the way I see things is that there are two paths. the first path is the path of enlightenment, of course.
I like that one.
I mean, because the alternative is the following: if we do not face the possibilities of creating a better future by using the spending powers of the state, of the government, if we don't do that, then we will continue the path that we've been going on continual kind of privatization, the destruction of the welfare state, and, as Steve Bannon said, the administrative state. This seems to be, an objective to destroy the agencies that were created to create, to support the welfare state. So you've got kind of an institutional destruction of the welfare state, a philosophical attack on it. You have the austerity, rules. So if that's the path we continue on, cut, institutional spending, etc., then that would mean our incomes will continue stagnating, perhaps declining. The immiseration will continue, and the situation cannot possibly continue, right? There will be change, right? At some point, people will want their government to do something else, except the means by which they will demand it are not going to be so, pleasant. And so that's why I'm saying, the path to enlightenment is perhaps to get the Democrats, behind a very truly progressive agenda that, kind of follows the Sanders model and that doesn't give excuses about spending, but talks about functional finance. We will measure our success by what we have achieved, not whether the budget has been balanced.
I love that, obviously. So if you were to have a new person coming into, just comes into you, meets you, and says, "Hi, Pavlina, what do you do?" And what would be your elevator pitch for modern monetary theory? Just your intro to MMT. What would that be?
Well, if they ask me, "How are you? What do you do?" I tell them that I'm a myth buster.
I love it.
Mythbuster? What kind of myths? Well, let me tell you. and then we begin, and then we begin with the first myth that the government is broke.
That's right.
So, I think your audience has heard the pitch very, very often, but you do need an entry, you need a way of relating to people, and it's not always easy, how to connect to them, to understand what worries them, what are their concerns, and try to address them, and I guess that's the way you create engagement.
That's exactly where I was going, because it's not so much just tell me MMT. That's real. I maybe said the question wrong. It really is. How, I get a lot of people, and I'm sure that you have this too. I'm positive you have this too. But, people are always tagging me in things, and they're trying to say, "Hey, can you answer this question?" And, they're sending me inbox, Steve, can you answer this? I have this conversation going on. And people aren't able to visually see through the way that this works. I guess the idea is, how do you connect real people that are not economically gifted, or maybe they've never been exposed to economics? How do you expose them just to get their palate wet? I mean, how do you get them ready to go? Just an intro. I mean, I've been popping people hard because I feel like I just need to wake them up. I'm afraid that the brainwashing from the media and everything else is so severe that the only thing people hear is shock jock. And that's not necessarily how everybody needs to operate. I'm just trying to wake people up. I'm a human alarm clock. But other people want to be able to engage in these conversations as well. And there's got to be like a kinder, softer, gentler way of getting in there. Let me wake them up, and then you go ahead and take them out to dinner.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's why most of my research is on unemployment, because, in a casual conversation, it's so often people say, "Oh, gee, I wish they fixed the road here," and God, those damn potholes, right? I mean, people, even in their normal conversation, express exasperation about their community or what their kid is missing, etc. And this is, and then you say, wouldn't it be nice if somebody was actually put to work, to do some of this stuff? And then you kind of oh, well, but there aren't, enough skilled people, but, they can do the job. And then you start saying, well, you know what? Rain or shine, there are so many more people who want to work than, the jobs are out there, the vacancies, the vacancies are out there. And so you begin. And I feel that, like I said, I've been saying before, people don't lose sleep over the budget. They lose sleep over their jobs. And so that is, it's not just you appeal to the emotional side, but that is the foundational aspect of our economic life. And so that's how I begin.
I love it. That's exactly it. So I think that's my next mission, is to go through a list of helping people relate point by point for how it connects to everyday people's lives. And you know what? That doesn't need to be an academic exercise. That requires just a heart and a little bit of reading. I've done that reading. So I'm hoping that I can translate these lessons into real world examples so that people have some sort of basis. I love that postcard a few years back that was put up, the MMT postcard to send in. I think we should be doing a lot more of that. I mean, we've got enough followers out there that are willing to make some noise to fight for a new deal, that we should be able to make this happen.
You should send it to Paul Ryan. I mean, when somebody circulated, here's Paul Ryan is not taking phone calls from his constituencies, but, maybe we can send him a postcard, please protect Social Security. I was thinking, wouldn't it be nice if he gets flooded with the MMT postcards?
Yes, I like that. Maybe we should, folks, I'll be putting that up here. I've posted it a million times. It'll be 1,000,001 as soon as we're done here. So with that, you're getting ready to go on a trip. Talk to us a little bit before you go. I want to give you the last word here.
Well, I'm leaving on Tuesday to the European Central Bank on the invitation of the president of their labor union. That came across some of my work on the job guarantee, and I know somebody who works actually at the ECB, and they offered some papers, and I've had some phone calls with them. I'm very enthusiastic, very, very interesting. To my surprise, honestly, a genuine surprise. But right now, the person that I've been talking to had put together a little proposal that went straight to Mario Draghi. I'm not holding my breath, but nevertheless, I'm looking forward to talking to them and just seeing what the environment is. It looks like they too are starved for ideas.
That's awesome. So let me ask you one final question. Do you know Yanis?
Varoufakis?
Yes.
Not personally, but yes.
I want to try to interview him. I've got to find a way to get him on here. I don't know how to go about doing it, but I'm going to try.
Well, we can put you in touch.
That would be awesome. Yeah. That would be very awesome. All right.
Currently, he is advocated for a job guarantee that was put in his plan for Europe 2025.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. Okay. So it's getting traction. All right. Well, with that, we're over time now, but I want to thank you. And I'm praying to goodness you'll come back again soon and join us. I love having you on here.
I love being on. So thanks to you. Thanks to everyone for the questions and comments.
Thank you very much. All right, folks. So just so you all know, Zach Haller will be on here at 10 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, 7 o'clock Pacific Time, talking about what's trending on Twitter. With that, I'm Steve Grumbine. It's Pavlina Cherneva. Thank you all very much for joining us, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.